The hearing will come to order. Good morning and welcome to the Budget Committee's hearing on the costs of climate change from coasts to heartland, health, and security. I want to welcome our witnesses here with us today. This morning we will be hearing from Admiral Ann Phillips, Special Assistant to the Governor of Virginia for Coastal Adaptation and Protection, Ms. Stephanie Grant, Senior Manager for External Affairs and Sustainability at Unilever, Dr. George Benjamin, Executive Director for the American Public Health Association, Admiral David Titli, Affiliate Professor of Meteorology and of International Affairs at the Pennsylvania State University, and Mr. Rich Powell, Executive Director at ClearPath. Welcome to you all. We look forward to hearing from you. Now yield myself 5 minutes for an opening statement. Today is a pretty intense day for Congress. Obviously, 2 buildings over, our colleagues on the Judiciary Committee are looking into how the president defied the laws of our country. Here, we're looking into how he and his administration continue to defy the laws of nature and the costs of that threat to the habitability of our entire planet. That's a pretty important undercard, if you ask me. And that's because every day that we wait to combat climate change, the potential impacts on our budget, our economy, our security, and our communities compound. We know that the economic costs of climate change will be significant and far-reaching. But to understand how these costs will affect American life and our fiscal situation, we must look deeper. Today, we will hear from experts on the looming threat of climate change to our coastal communities, agricultural economies, public health, and national security, and the implications for the federal budget. The devastating effects of climate change are already upon us. Families have lost their homes to record storms and raging wildfires and lost loved ones to sicknesses stemming from heat waves and degraded air quality. Our farmers are grappling with changing growing seasons and declining crop yields, while approximately half of all U.S. military sites and 2/3 of the most critical installations are threatened by climate change. Without serious action, climate-related federal spending will continue to rise, and American families will not only have to grapple with the effects of climate change, they will have to foot the bill for the spiraling costs. By neglecting this crisis, we are putting our coastal communities and millions of people at risk. Since 2016, more than 3,400 Americans have been killed by hurricanes, severe storms, and flooding. Homes, businesses, and infrastructure on our coasts are facing more extreme natural disasters. Already, 8 out of 9 U.S. real estate companies are citing operational risks and costs from flooding and hurricanes in their environmental disclosures. As the risk of being hit by a Category 4 or 5 hurricane continues to grow, U.S. military facilities along the coast are vulnerable as well, threatening our military and defense readiness. In the Heartland, farmers are facing declining crop yields and increasingly hostile growing environments. As the climate warms and rainfall patterns change, the soil is eroding, floods and droughts are becoming more common, and the threats of heat stress, diseases, and pests to plants and livestock are exacerbated. Farm incomes are already down almost 50% from 2013, and over the next 3 decades, our agricultural economy could see an annual productivity drop of more than 4% from complications related to climate change. With our farms under siege at home and demand growing worldwide, American families will find it more expensive and more difficult to put food on the table. As pretty much anyone in this room can attest, July 2019 is on pace to be the hottest month ever recorded, with heat advisories and health warnings cautioning us to protect ourselves and our families against scorching temperatures. These dangerous heat waves are predicted to become more frequent in the years ahead, posing a severe threat to our nation's most vulnerable. By 2050, more than 90 million Americans, a 100-fold increase, will experience a month or more temperatures indexing above 105 degrees in an average year. Heat stroke, respiratory illnesses, and heart attacks could kill thousands more every year, and more people will be exposed to infectious diseases transmitted by mosquitoes and ticks such as West Nile, Zika, and Lyme disease, as the insects spread across broader areas of the United States. But the United States will not suffer in isolation. Countries across the world will experience similar challenges, many to an even greater degree. Even before the president pulled the U.S. out of the Paris Climate Agreement, former Secretary of Defense James Mattis cautioned that climate change is, quote, a driver of instability with the potential to upend the international arena. Around the world, populations will experience greater food and water insecurity, more infectious disease outbreaks, worsening natural disasters, and other threat multipliers. This in turn will heighten the risk of social unrest, political instability, and conflict abroad, with the potential to jeopardize our national security, compromise our defense readiness, and increase the cost and complexity of future missions and humanitarian efforts. But this future, as bleak as it is, does not have to come to fruition. As our witnesses will testify, we can reduce carbon pollution and make meaningful investments in our health and safety. Thankfully, the deal reached earlier this week to raise the budget caps will empower Congress to continue making critical investments in clean energy and resilience while avoiding potentially damaging fiscal and environmental impacts of the sequester. And it is my hope that this hearing will enable Congress to better prepare for the wide-ranging impacts of a changing climate. And now I yield to Ranking Member Womack for his opening statement.
I thank the chairman for holding this hearing. Welcome to our panel. This is the second opportunity we've had this year to discuss climate change. I'm hopeful that we can examine common sense solutions that balance environmental challenges, the nation's economic needs, and the budgetary reality facing all of us. When this committee met last month, we heard testimony about the impacts of the changing climate. While we have our differences on how to address the issue, one thing was made clear to me, and that is we recognize a responsibility to support sustainability and the energy needs of the future. And Mr. Chairman, I recall at our last hearing on this topic, you wanted to discuss a full range of solutions to climate change, not only the Green New Deal, and I couldn't agree more. While the Democrats' prevailing plan, the Green New Deal, has the support of nearly 100 members of the caucus, 12 of whom serve on this committee, and bears a $93 trillion price tag, Republicans are focused on serious solutions that leverage innovation and American ingenuity to address our challenges. We support strategies that take action against harmful emissions without disrupting the economy and burdening hardworking Americans with new taxes and mandates. By being good stewards of the environment and advancing an all of the above energy plan, we can support productivity and sustainability for the future. Meanwhile, the Green New Deal would impose drastic, impossible energy mandates that would eradicate jobs and, in some cases, entire industries. Congress should focus on policies that build on our successes and create a robust innovation pipeline, not sweeping overhauls that stifle competition and economic progress while adding trillions more to our debt and destroy sectors of our economy. We should break down regulatory barriers that hamper research and development and encourage investments into current and emerging technologies, including carbon capture, renewable hydropower, nuclear power, and energy storage. The United States is at the forefront of clean energy efforts, and we must continue to leverage current capabilities. Nuclear power generation, which accounts for 20% of our nation's power supply, is a great example of technology that is fueling the U.S., creating jobs, growing our economy, and reducing the environmental impact. We should double down on efforts that promote increased private sector development of next-generation nuclear technology. Policies like the bipartisan H.R. 1760, the Advanced Nuclear Fuel Availability Act, which passed the House last Congress and was reintroduced this March by my friend and colleague from Texas, Mr. Flores, will help us do just that. Resuming the nuclear waste storage program at Yucca Mountain, which I visited last July, can also help to ensure more nuclear plants don't close for a lack of a repository. With 340 of my colleagues, the House passed the Nuclear Waste Policy Amendments Act last year. Nuclear energy is important to both our power supply and addressing climate change, and I hope that House leadership will bring this bill to the floor to move forward on this critical nuclear waste storage program. Pursuing other available resources, such as natural gas, will allow us to take advantage of more efficient, cleaner, and economical energy options. Carbon capture technology will make this source even cleaner. My colleague from Texas, Mr. Crenshaw, recently introduced H.R. 3828, the leading act of 2019, bipartisan legislation that prioritizes funding for research and development for technology to capture carbon emissions. I'm pleased to support this bill as well. American ingenuity has solved many challenges, and I applaud my colleagues for pushing effective policies that maintain and accelerate our clean energy edge on multiple fronts. So as we examine the ideas in front of us today, I encourage my friends on the other side of the aisle to consider the solutions that have been put forward by my colleagues. These proposals are bipartisan, they're viable, and they're cost-effective to the radical Green New Deal. It is my hope that we can come together to support market-based solutions that make clean energy more affordable and reliable, create jobs, and address climate change challenges. Mr. Chairman, I look forward to hearing from our witnesses today, and I yield back the balance of my time.
I thank the ranking member for his opening remarks. In the interest of time, if any other members have opening statements, you may submit those statements in writing for the record. Once again, I want to thank our witnesses for being here this morning. The committee has received your written testimony, and that will be made part of the formal hearing record. Each of you will have 5 minutes to give your oral remarks. Admiral Phillips, you may begin when you are ready.
Thank you, Chairman Yarmouth, Ranking Member Womack, members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to testify before you today. My name is Ann Phillips. I serve as the Special Assistant to the Governor of Virginia for Coastal Adaptation and Protection. I'm a retired surface warfare officer. I drove and commanded ships for the United States Navy for 31 years, served aboard in Guam and Lisbon, Portugal, and operated extensively with NATO and Partnership for Peace Nations. I retired in 2014 as a Rear Admiral and Commander of Expeditionary Strike Group 2 and have been involved in multiple efforts since then, highlighting the impact of climate change on national security. Today, I'm here to talk about the significant impact that climate change has on coastal communities in Virginia. There's an urgent need for a coordinated federal effort to deal with the impacts that this is causing to us. This committee can help by recognizing climate resilience and disaster preparedness as one of the country's greatest and most immediate needs, taking action to address that need now. In Virginia, we have over 10,000 miles of tidally influenced shoreline. We've experienced over 18 inches of relative sea level rise in 100 years. The duration, severity, and impact of flooding have increased substantially, and coastal storms are magnified as a result. Projections show we are likely to receive an additional 18 inches of relative sea level rise by mid-century. We are dealing with water where we did not plan for it to be, and which impedes the expected pattern of our daily lives in some form every day. We're not simply preparing, we are living with water now. Virginia, coastal Virginia, has a water-based economy. It is at risk. The cornerstones of that economy are our federal presence, arguably the largest concentration in the nation, including our largest naval base, Naval Station Norfolk, the only shipyard where we build aircraft carriers, and one of only 2 places where we build nuclear-powered submarines, Newport News Shipbuilding, owned by Huntington Ingalls. We also have the Port of Virginia, 6th largest container port by traffic volume in the country, generating $80 billion in annual economic impact for the state. We have beach and water-related tourism, which generates $5.2 billion for our coastal region. Aquaculture and fisheries, $1.4 billion in annual sales. And our waterfront property and housing stock, a key source of property tax income for both urban and rural localities. As an example of the impacts on some of Virginia's cities now, the city of Virginia Beach has estimated $2.4 billion in anticipated costs to reduce flooding and storm impacts across that city. This will protect 45,000 homes and 85 square miles, approximately a quarter of that city's territory. And the city of Norfolk, working with the Army Corps of Engineers, has an estimated $1.57 billion in proposed projects to reduce the impact of storm surge. This does not address recurrent flooding caused by sea level rise, tides, winds, and rainfall, and it did not include any Department of Defense property impacts or outcomes. Virginia has laid groundwork to prepare, creating a series of boards and commissions and scientific studies over the past 10 years. The challenge has been that the General Assembly has been reluctant to take funded action on climate change or sea level rise, most recently rejecting a proposal from Governor Northam during the 2019 General Assembly to dedicate more than $50 million a year from the sale of carbon pollution allowances towards coastal resilience. As a result, local governments are taking the lead. They're fighting sea level rise and recurrent flooding, and they understand the scope, scale, and cost of those challenges today and in the future. Under Governor Northam, Virginia is taking action, bold and substantive action, to build capacity as we worked with the General Assembly to address funding to deal with this existential threat. Last November, Governor Northam signed into practice Executive Order 24, increasing Virginia's resilience to sea level rise and natural hazards. This will require the Commonwealth to determine the vulnerability and set standards for state-owned infrastructure, develop a coastal protection master plan for the state, coordinate and collaborate and communicate across state, federal, and local government. Through this process, we'll be able to determine the best and most practical, innovative, and cost-effective solutions to adapt and protect our infrastructure. We'll be able to use creative and less costly green-gray infrastructure approaches for more dispersed assets. We'll be able to focus on underserved communities. And finally, we will leverage federal and state funds to align them to make coastal Virginia more resilient. Even with strong state action, we can't do this alone. The actions of Congress and this committee are vitally important to protecting people and property. Congress must follow through on the recent budget cap agreement to lift the sequester on non-defense discretionary spending and to ensure that agencies like FEMA, the Army Corps, NOAA, USGS, NASA, HUD, and others have adequate funding to help protect communities. And again, this committee must recognize that climate resilience and disaster preparedness are one of the country's greatest and most immediate needs. Rising waters and recurrent flooding know no political boundaries. They know no boundaries of wealth or race or of society. Virginia is committed to building capacity for our coastal communities and to build resilience to this threat. We have no time to waste. Time and tide wait for no man. Thank you again for the opportunity to submit this testimony today, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Admiral Phillips. I now recognize Ms. Grant for 5 minutes.
Chairman Yarmouth, Ranking Member Womack, and members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to discuss the cost of climate change as it relates to agriculture and supply chains. I'm excited to share with you the work Unilever does to assist farmers in becoming resilient to today's extreme weather, while at the same time creating healthier soils. My name is Stephanie Grant, and I am Senior Manager, External Affairs and Sustainability for Unilever. Unilever is a global consumer affairs company whose brand includes Dove, Hellmann's, and Ben & Jerry's. 7 out of every 10 households around the world contain at least one Unilever product. Whatever the brand, wherever it's bought, we're working to ensure that it plays a part in helping fulfill our purpose as a business, making sustainable living commonplace. We want our business to grow, but we recognize that the growth at the expense of people or the environment is both unacceptable and commercially unsustainable. The U.S. just suffered through its wettest 12-month period in history. Extreme climate swings have created 10 million abandoned acres due to floods this year, which roughly equals about $6.5 billion in lost revenue. And studies indicate that the extreme weather events will continue to increase. The USDA Economic Research Service released a report just this week that shows, due to climate change, crop insurance costs will increase between 3.5% to 37% by 2080. Food prices are dependent upon several factors, with crop availability one of the most important. However, it is difficult to predict exactly how climate change will affect food prices. For commodity pricing, shortages in one part of the world affect prices in other parts of the world. For example, corn is used globally for livestock feed and feedstock for biofuels, and swings in production can ripple through global markets, leading to price spikes. As a company, we are also looking to better understand how extreme weather events will affect our sourcing of key ingredients in the future, as we prefer to source our ingredients as locally as possible. Given this, we use crop forecasting models, which provides data on predicted yield changes around the world to allow better planning on crop sourcing. At Unilever, we believe tackling climate change requires transformational changes to broader systems in which we operate. We believe a strong government policy that creates the right context for change and business action is needed. In my role, I design and implement our sustainable sourcing programs in the U.S. We've been working with farmers since 2013, listening to understand the issues they face. We recently relaunched our Hellmann's Sustainable Soy Program, focusing on soil health and nutrient runoff reduction through providing cost share and technical assistance for cover crops. Cover crops help build resilient soils and allow farmers to use less inputs over time. And for our Knorr brand, we are working with rice farmers in Arkansas to help them test different practices that use less water, as rice is a very water-intensive crop. We've partnered with the University of Arkansas to collect and analyze the practices, yields, and water usage, and share the data back with the growers. It is imperative that Congress prepare for extreme weather through policies to help make farms more resilient to be able to adapt to the changing conditions. Since the 1930s, there has not been a piece of legislation that solely focused on soil resiliency for farmers. We believe that focusing on soil resiliency is not as a good conservation practice, but as a good farming practice, will help farmers adapt to the extreme weather they increasingly face. We ask Congress to consider the following to help farmers become more resilient. We encourage Congress to increase funding for the National Resource Conservation Service field offices and grant programs for farmers to test and scale resilient soil health practices. Increased funding is also needed for coordinated national research on soil health and resilient practices, along with continued research into long-term cropping systems. And we believe the Risk Management Agency should treat cover crops as any other crop under crop insurance and allow farmers and their agronomic advisors to make the relevant management decisions. In closing, I want to share a story from a farmer we work with through Practical Farmers of Iowa who helps advise our Hellman's farmers on cover crops. His name is Nathan Anderson, and he farms in Northwest Iowa alongside his dad. This is his story. While often working together, my dad and I have Brains of the Day and Brawn of the Day award. In 2013, after a few years of using no-till and cover crops, we had a devastatingly heavy rainfall event. The water from a neighboring field was streaming off with enough force you could take a kayak across the field. Once that water entered our field, the force of the water slowed, the sediment it was carrying dropped out, and its impact was lessened. My dad looked out the window through the pouring rain at that stream of water and said matter-of-factly, "That may be the Brains of the Year award." This is one of many examples I hear from growers on why it is so important to build soil health for resiliency. As a company, we believe it is important to invest in our farmers and help them become more resilient. We call on Congress to do the same. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you for your testimony. I now recognize Admiral Titli for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Chairman Yarmouth, Ranking Member Womack, and distinguished members of the committee for the opportunity to present today. It's a privilege to come before you at this hearing and discuss this very important topic. I'm David Titli. From 2013 to 2019, I served as the founding director of the Center for Solutions to Weather and Climate Risk at the Pennsylvania State University. I served in the U.S. Navy for 32 years, retiring in 2012 as the oceanographer and navigator of the Navy and the director of U.S. Navy Task Force Climate Change. I continue to serve as an unpaid advisor for several organizations, including the National Academy of Science and the Center for Climate and Security. I'm testifying today in my personal capacity. In the Navy, we have a saying, just give me the bottom line up front, or the bluff. So here's my bluff for today's hearing. For the Pentagon, adapting to climate change is a readiness issue. It is not a partisan or political issue or a desire to appear green. The department needs to manage the risks of climate change to ensure its readiness in the years and decades to come. The ice does not care which party has control of the House or Senate or who is in the White House. It just melts. The extremes of yesterday do not foretell the extremes of tomorrow. We have an excellent understanding of how our climate system works based on 150 years of science. If we choose to leverage this science, it will help us strengthen our society and our security. And finally, the rapid change in climate has significant impacts on our national security. The days of climate stability we have experienced for most of human civilization are over. Changing climate impacts the national security in 3 significant ways. Changing the battle space, or the physical environment in which our soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines will operate. The Arctic is a prime example of an operational environment that is changing rapidly today. It poses increasing risk to the Department of Defense's installations. Without fully operational bases and training ranges in the United States, and in addition to key overseas bases, U.S. forces cannot maintain the required levels of readiness. And finally, it is important to note that a changing climate can make already unstable situations worse, and sometimes catastrophically so. Climate change can be a powerful link in a chain of events that, if not broken, can lead to runaway instability. We will be managing the risks of climate change for decades to come. It is not an issue that will be solved with a single policy or program. So what to do? My written testimony contains specific actions that, if enacted, would help the Department of Defense manage their risk from climate change. These include developing authorized standards, data on vulnerabilities, and the value of each installation, understanding this is a challenge that does not stop at a fence line, and ensuring that a climate sanity check is part of any training, procurement, or base construction process. 50 years ago, we went to the moon and returned safely, not knowing everything we needed to know at the start of that journey. President Kennedy rightfully emphasized how hard meeting the challenge would be, but also how important it was to achieve our goal. In today's dollars, the Apollo program cost about $150 billion. That's a lot of money. But to put it in perspective, natural disasters in 2017 cost American citizens over $300 billion, the equivalent of 2 Apollo missions. We all know we need to expeditiously decarbonize our society and the world's economy, but many of us are rightfully concerned about the potential societal and economic dislocations and costs such policies might bring about. Imagine an Apollo-scale program, $150 billion over a decade to attack the challenges of energy storage and transmission, cost-effective generation of non-carbon-based power regardless of weather conditions, and an ability to economically and safely remove greenhouse gases from the atmosphere when that is the only practical solution. Like Apollo, there would be huge private sector participation. Like Apollo, there would be spin-offs that would propel society for decades to come. Unlike Apollo, there would be even greater opportunities for international collaboration. So what should be the goal? To effectively decarbonize the U.S. and the global economies by mid-century without shock and disruption. It will be hard, but so is going to the moon. Thank you very much for your time and attention, and I look forward to your questions. I yield my time.
Thank you very much for your testimony, and I now recognize Dr. Benjamin for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Yarmouth and Ranking Member Womack and members of the committee. I wanted to thank you for inviting me on behalf of the American Public Health Association to testify today on the serious public health threats we face from climate change. Let me just point out that we strongly believe that climate change is certainly here now, is impacting our health today. And I want to do that through a look at 3 specific health threats. Let's start with extreme heat. Obviously, we just finished a week of extreme heat across most of the United States. And according to press reports, we've had at least 6 heat-related deaths from this particular heat wave to date. We also know that exposure to extreme heat kills more than people in the United States than any other weather-related threat, more than 600 people annually. We also know that extreme heat events are on the rise, and it's projected by the year 2050 by the EPA that we have approximately 3,400 more premature deaths each year. Heat-related illness disproportionately affects climate-sensitive populations. If you think about children and older adults who are the populations most at risk, are prone to heat stress because they have a harder time regulating basically their body. People who work outside, like agriculture and construction workers, are increased risk because they're working outside. Floods are one of the deadliest weather-related hazards in the United States, second only to heat. And we've already seen an increase in the number of heavy precipitation events in the United States, which led to several floods. Now, floodwaters can become contaminated with agricultural waste, chemicals, and raw sewage, and that sewage carries disease, which has disease-causing bacteria, parasites, and viruses. We know that poor water quality leads to more illnesses, and even a few inches of standing water can lead to injury. Drought conditions bring wildfires, dust storms, and reduce air quality. As we recently seen in California and in some other parts of the country, exposure to wildfire smoke increases the incidence of respiratory and cardiovascular problems for communities both near and far. Severe storms, including hurricanes and tornadoes, impact the health of a population in just many ways. Acute traumatic events, obviously, but also during the event and then even cleanup. Toxic chemical exposures from leaked materials, food and water contamination, and actually the loss of the healthcare infrastructure from not just hospitals, but even just losing your country and corner public health practice due to blocked roads, sidewalks, loss of power, and basic damage to the infrastructure. I would be remiss if I didn't talk about the impact of both short-term and long-term mental health challenges, which often go underappreciated. With climate change becomes more air pollution. This can lead to increased risk of health from cardiovascular disease and other respiratory conditions like allergies and asthma. Asthma causes about 3.8 million missed work and school days each year, causing indirect impact on education and work productivity. Now, this is important because educational attainment and economic mobility is strongly linked to improved health. Asthma itself is responsible for nearly 2 million emergency department visits each year. And in 2016, it was projected that asthma costs about $56 billion in costs each year in both direct and indirect costs. Greater rainfall and warmer temperatures influence the geographic distribution of mosquitoes and ticks to where people live. They can spread diseases such as dengue fever, malaria, yellow fever, West Nile virus. And of course, we saw with Zika fever, the microcephaly and other birth defects that can come, which is a significant issue at an extraordinary cost, both a human cost and a financial cost. Now, we know that some people are at greater health risk. Climate-sensitive populations with limited resources to adapt to climate change will experience a disproportionately greater adverse health impact. Vulnerable populations do this because they depend on fundamentally community resilience, and communities can increase their general resilience by addressing really the core social determinants of health: poverty, educational attainment, social capital, and of course access to health care. Now, there are costs. The health, social, and economic costs of climate change are vast, and at least one study has estimated a health costs looked at 6 climate-related events, which range anywhere from $14 to $40 billion, and that's really an important study. In addition, if you think about the costs to the federal budget for things like Medicare, Medicaid, the Veterans Health Administration, and Department of Defense, we really don't know what those costs are, but certainly they're going to grow substantially. In closing, as a physician, I just want you to know I believe that there is hope. We can treat this, but time is not on our side. Congress and the administration must take steps now to address climate change by reducing greenhouse gas emissions, strengthening the ability of our federal, state, and local public health agencies to protect the public from the health threats associated with climate change. And thank you, and I'll be happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Dr. Benjamin, and I now recognize Mr. Powell for 5 minutes.
Good morning, and thank you, Chairman Yarmuth, Ranking Member Womack, and members of the committee. My name is Rich Powell. I lead ClearPath, a nonprofit advancing conservative policies that accelerate clean energy globally. We advocate markets over mandates and innovation over regulation. An important note, we receive zero funding from industry. Given this committee's vital role in America's climate policy, I will today discuss a few topics. First, how the global nature of the climate challenge requires an innovation-focused policy. Second, how we ought to invest in innovation versus simply spending on clean energy. Third, how these investments in clean energy must be oriented around aggressive goals. Fourth, how a goals mindset challenges us to rethink the basic versus applied divide in research and development. And fifth and finally, how you can build on last Congress's bipartisan clean innovation record. Before diving into budget policy, I think it's first always important to address the elephant in the room. Climate change is real. Global industrial activity is the dominant contributor, and the challenge it poses to our health, our security, our agriculture, our infrastructure, and our communities merits significant action at every level of government and the private sector. The National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration estimates that the 5-year running average damages of weather events has risen 5-fold over the past 20 years, from $20 billion to $100 billion annually. As you also well know, managing our national debt is another defining challenge of this century. This committee must balance both demands. First, we must remember the global nature of this challenge. America should do its part, but even if the U.S. eliminated greenhouse emissions tomorrow, the growth in CO2 by 2050 by developing Asian countries alone would exceed total U.S. emissions today. Now, for too long, this sobering reality was used to justify inaction. Instead, it should serve as a call to action towards an immense opportunity: high-paying jobs, a manufacturing renaissance, thriving U.S. exports. Second, we need to reorient our climate policy mindset from spending to investing. As a consultant at McKinsey & Company, the most important business philosophy I used came from the great Stephen Covey: begin with the end in mind. On climate change, our end ought to be developing countries buying clean energy instead of traditional technologies. We cannot spend our way to that end. The global energy system is too large, our budget too small. Rather, we must invest scarce taxpayer dollars into clean innovations that the global economy will choose on their economic merits. This is a market-based climate solution. Unfortunately, our energy debate is often caught between extremes. On one side, some advocate virtually no federal investment. Others seek permanent subsidies to favored technologies. To the first point, why shouldn't clean tech emerge like Silicon Valley innovation? Unfortunately, two people in a garage rarely innovate advanced energy. It requires massive scale, and regulations scare power producers away from new tech. The oft-described valley of death between a lab and a profitable business is deep. Taxpayers supported all new energy sources in recent decades. Going forward, government should neither command and control a solution, nor do nothing and hope. Government should support a wide portfolio of clean innovations and ramp down support as technologies mature. The potential clean returns of such investing are literally world-changing. Third, let me address the importance of strong objectives in clean energy investments. When DOE has clear goals based on market-relevant cost and performance targets, along with strong leadership and accountability and steady investments, it produces breakthroughs. The Sunshot Initiative to radically decrease the cost of solar is a strong example. Another prime example, since 2013, DOE has invested in next-generation small modular nuclear reactors in partnership with NuScale. Earlier this week, NuScale announced that the U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commission completed the second and third phases of design review. They are a big step closer to marketing the world's first SMR, potentially by 2026. Fourth, Congress must grow past the outdated mindset of basic-only research. Nothing has illustrated this more than the shale gas boom. This breakthrough produced an economic windfall estimated at $100 billion annually and has driven power sector emissions down since 2005. It emerged from combined basic and applied research and targeted tax incentives and private sector contributions. We should remember that our global competitors have no philosophy against applied research. The Chinese have scooped up U.S. innovators struggling to commercialize here in America. A basic-only research agenda is essentially a subsidy to the Chinese economy, not a wise investment. Finally, how do we build on your strong bipartisan record of clean innovation? The FY18 and 19 appropriations bills were great successes. ClearPath applauded the critical investments in advanced nuclear, carbon capture, grid-scale storage, and other clean energy technologies. Lawmakers maintained U.S. leadership in clean innovation, a principle essential to prioritize again in your FY20 bills. Steady DOE funding is required, but even more important are direction and goals to ensure dollars are invested wisely. Thank you again for the opportunity to testify. ClearPath is eager to assist the committee in your important work.
Thank you, Mr. Powell, and thanks again to all the witnesses for their prepared remarks. And we now begin our question and answer period. The ranking member and I will defer our questions till the end. So I now will yield 5 minutes to the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Scott.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, one reality with climate change is the same reality that we're going to address this afternoon with the pension crisis, and that is that the cost of doing nothing greatly exceeds the cost of doing something. We know with the pension plan, we could fix it for about $50 billion. If we do nothing, the federal budget will be hit with $170 to $400 billion. Climate change is the same. We need to make the investments in climate change for resiliency when the flood comes or when the event occurs. If you have invested in resiliency, the damage done will be much less. Let me ask Admiral Phillips, and I thank you for your service in the military and continuing that service, helping us address the sea level rise. Could you tell us what the cost of sea level rise will be to our military if we do nothing?
Congressman Scott, thank you very much for that question. The challenge for the military is, of course, focused on readiness and resilience. And the cost of doing nothing is that they will be repeatedly exposed, as they have been this year with Tyndall, with off at the in Nebraska, to repeated incidences of increasingly severe weather-related impacts that have cost outcomes. Not only will they have to deal with those kinds of impacts here at home in the United States, and I would add Hampton roads can be added to that list because it's not a question of if with us, it's a question of when. And Isabel in 2003 was one of the most expensive storms at the time for the Department of Defense, particularly as related to Langley Air Force Base. But the challenge is not only here within the United States, it's also the challenge in our ability to operate downrange, to execute our mission, and the constant environmental impacts which degrade readiness over time in that theater, in that operating theater. So not only are you challenged in preparing, in executing your training and readiness missions here within the United States, when you go downrange, you have an additional level, a threat multiplier, as Chairman Yarmouth used in his opening remarks, a threat magnifier that will add increased challenges and stress to your ability to execute your mission. That will all come at a cost. And the longer we wait to prepare for that cost, the more expensive, just like preparing the coast of Virginia, the more expensive those costs will rise, and the window and the variety of challenges and options that we will have will decrease. So it's going to be a building impactor over time, and we are behind. We're behind in preparing coastal Virginia. We're behind in preparing the Department of Defense. We are chasing the target because we are not willing to engage upfront, set standards, and plan appropriately so that we are prepared for what we will encounter in our future.
Thank you. Earlier this month, I had the pleasure of attending the Hampton Roads Planning District Commission meeting that you were at. We are seeing that the cities and Hampton Roads are working together, but why is federal support needed if the localities are in fact working together?
Well, Congressman, a lot of the the challenge is working directly for a federal entity to work directly with a city or a locality. There are reasons based on funding and law, funding streams that don't exactly cross and align, budget cycles don't align, planning processes and planning horizons don't necessarily align. However, in Hampton Roads, which is a wonderful example, all those federal facilities are deeply embedded within our communities. The people that work on those facilities, whether they are soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines, are all living in those communities. The contract support, the logistics support, the infrastructure support for those communities, the utilities, all comes from the surrounding communities. So you can't isolate those facilities and protect them. You must work within the broader community effort, the broader community, the broader region, in this case we're talking about Hampton Roads, to coordinate a response to be able to prepare not only those communities, but also to support those federal facilities who are mutually reliant upon each other. Their futures are inextricably linked. You can't solve one problem without solving it holistically.
Thank you. Dr. Benjamin, the Education and Labor Committee recently held a hearing on how to deal with worker-related mostly heat-related health problems. How can we best protect the health of workers who are exposed to heat on a regular basis?
You know, it's, I spent the first 9 years of my clinical career practicing medicine in the Army. And one of the things I learned was that it was very important for a commander to be responsible for their troops. And that means keeping them physically fit, well hydrated, and paying a lot of attention to the weather, and building that into the work process to protect workers. And that's going to be essential that we do that, and that we pass legislation to ensure that workers are properly protected. I know there's some legislation on the Hill right now to begin looking at that, and we've been in support of that legislation.
Thank you.
Gentleman's time has expired. I now recognize the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Woodall, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. You described the Judiciary Committee hearing going on across the way in your opening statement. I don't think any minds are going to be changed or any new information is going to be provided there this morning. I hope that is not going to be true of our committee here. You also referenced the administration as continuing to defy the laws of nature and the cost of that threat to the habitability of our entire planet. I know a lot of folks believe that to be true, which is why I very much appreciated, Mr. Powell, you're referencing the last 2 years of success, bipartisan success that we've had. I don't see a pathway forward in an us against them dynamic. To your point, it's not just us against them, Democrats and Republicans. It can't be us against them on a planetary level. We're all in this together, and I very much appreciate your bringing that forward. I'm thinking about that Apollo level project that Admiral Titli described. In your testimony, Admiral Titli, you said the days of climate stability we have experienced for most of human civilization are over. Is an Apollo level project going to change that statement? Is that your conclusion if we do nothing? Or is that your conclusion, even if we engage at the very high level that you're proposing?
Thanks very much, Congressman, for the question. So if we do nothing, if we continue business as usual, then that stability that we have built human civilization on is absolutely over. And we are going to take ourselves, not to be apocalyptic, but we are going to take ourselves into a place where we have not ever seen civilization before. 7, 8 degree average temperature rises, and that would equate long-term to sea level rises of 20 to 30 feet.
All of which we could prevent
So
if we were...
Exactly. If we get serious about this issue, and I would define 100 to 200 billion, roughly an Apollo-type program, wisely spent, wisely managed with leadership, and as one of the witnesses said, as with defined goals. So how do you buy down this risk? And the way we buy down the risk is to ultimately decarbonize not only the U.S., but the world economy. And then we can get back to stability, or more stability, and we've managed this problem.
Well, Mr. Powell mentioned we've got to figure out where it is that we're going. I'm thinking about your testimony, Ms. Grant, about Unilever. Even within a company, you all have set carbon pricing at 3 different levels, as I understand your testimony. One Unilever-wide, one with Ben & Jerry's and its supply chain, and one with your beauty...
Love Beauty Planet.
Love Beauty Planet line. How in the world am I supposed to bring 435 members of Congress together on a carbon pricing scheme that's the right one, when even as a company that is following your internal drive, you've not been able to come together on a single carbon pricing model?
Within that, we do allow some of our companies, such as Ben & Jerry's, to operate on their own as we've brought them in and we've let them continue operating with that. But we do have a number of principles and groups that we support, that we put out principles that we would suggest, and I'm happy to give those to you after the hearing to kind of lay out what we think it should do. But we do support carbon pricing and think that's a way forward.
If we set a carbon pricing model as a nation that was lower than the one that you all have adopted as a company, would you lower your standards to meet the new federal mandate?
As we're a global company, we'd probably keep our global level.
Probably would. Mr. Powell, let me tell you, every time I drive up the BW Parkway, I'm going through Northeast D.C. and Maryland, where I see all the solar panels on the north sides of houses under big, beautiful oak trees. Drives me crazy because I know that a taxpayer at the federal, state, or local level subsidize that, and we're not getting the smart value out of that. When you're talking across the spectrum in your business, do you find any resistance on whether it be ideological or international towards trying to find a smart pathway forward as opposed to just throwing everything against the wall and seeing what sticks? That $100 billion program can go by pretty fast, that Admiral Titli mentioned, if we're just throwing it everywhere instead of at the very targeted places that we know we can do the most good.
I do think most folks, and I think there's wide bipartisan support for a smart, goals-oriented investment policy in this space. I do think that there has been a tendency to try all of these efforts, right, like widespread rooftop solar, for example, that actually have very, very small kind of carbon impact. We would argue that the thing we've got to be thinking about is much more, how does a Nigerian energy policymaker, how does an Indian energy policymaker think about what they're going to do, and what's a like-for-like substitute to the kind of investments they're going to make? So if they were going to build a massive new traditional coal-fired power plant, the substitute for that is probably going to be another great big power plant like a nuclear reactor or a coal plant with carbon capture or a natural gas plant with carbon capture or a huge grid-scale solar project with battery storage attached, and that's actually the kind of thing that we ought to be focusing more of our attention on, more globally relevant sorts of clean energy solutions.
That seems like something we could find a vast agreement on, Mr. Powell. Thank you very much. Thank you for your indulgence, Mr. Chairman.
Absolutely. Gentleman's time has expired. I now recognize the gentleman from Massachusetts, the Vice Chair of the committee, Mr. Moulton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Admiral Titli, could you address the degree to which climate change, increased droughts and things like that are already exacerbating national security issues around the globe, places like Syria, the Sahel?
Yeah, thank you for the question. So when I teach this in my graduate class on climate and security policy, there is an interaction between sort of what I call the business end of climate, which is extreme events, weather extreme events. What are the thresholds? And those thresholds are going to depend on the community itself. I mean, if you're a farmer in Syria, you probably have different agricultural thresholds, let's say, than somebody with sophisticated irrigation in the United States. And then finally, what's the government response? What's the society and government response? And as we've seen in Syria, when we had an extreme drought, and my colleagues in the attribution world can definitively link that drought to our changing climate, and the crops fail, and you have a government that not only does not help its people, but it's actually whooping up, it's exacerbating the ethnic tensions, you then have a catastrophe. And we've seen this catastrophe play out in geopolitically, we've seen it humanitarian, we've seen the migrations. So all of those come together. So the climate is what I talk about as a link in a chain of events. If you've ever done an aircraft mishap investigation, many things come together, and climate is one of those pieces, but it also depends on what are the thresholds and what can be the society response.
Does America face a greater threat from Russia in the Northwest, in Alaska, because of climate change?
I think threats are a combination of capability and intentions.
Because I can tell you that the commanding general of the base up there made it very clear to members of the Armed Service Committee that we do.
He sees, yes, the Russians are certainly very active in the Arctic, and they continue to be active in the Arctic. And as that ice melts, there's a reason for that, because the economies, the shipping routes, at least seasonally, are ultimately going to move up there.
Do we face
global?
What are the costs of the threats to installations like Paris Island, for example, where half the country's Marines are trained due to climate change?
If we do not take it into account, it's easily billions of dollars. We saw $8 billion of weather-related disasters to the DoD installations just in 2017 alone.
So how do you explain the continued Republican attempts on the Armed Services Committee and in the full Congress to prohibit the Department of Defense from addressing climate change, from studying climate change, from even including it in their reports, when the Department of Defense clearly wants to address this?
I think what's happening is I would say we're seeing a change in that, starting with the 2017 House, the Langevin Amendment, which was approved by a then Republican-controlled House. I believe we are starting to see a change in that. Certainly a few years ago, yes, sir, we saw a lot of resistance. I think it's changing.
Scientists have been saying this for decades now. And Republicans are just now beginning to acknowledge it in the last couple of years.
Better late than never.
Well, I agree. My concern is that it's getting very, very, very late.
There's a saying we use that when you're flying an airplane, one of the things that is of no use is runway behind you. We're putting a lot of runway behind us here.
Mr. Powell, I want to ask you about the role of nuclear power. What is the role of nuclear power in addressing climate change? My understanding is it is the single biggest source of carbon-free energy that we have today in America.
First, thank you for the question and your attention to this issue. It is indeed the largest source of carbon-free generation in the United States today. It's more than 50%, so it's larger than all of the wind and all of the solar and all of the hydro and all of the biomass combined right now in the U.S. Into the future, it's likely to remain a dominant source of clean energy. It's really the one source of clean energy we currently have that can operate 24/7 and with high resilience, even in very difficult conditions. And virtually every climate model that looks at how we would get to a zero emissions future has a very large role for both traditional and advanced nuclear energy.
How many Americans have died due to nuclear power accidents?
I don't believe any Americans have died due to nuclear power accidents.
Do we have premature deaths due to coal-fired power plants through asthma and other things?
Those emissions are contributors to premature deaths, yes.
Great, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, gentlemen. His time has expired. I now recognize the gentleman from Missouri, Mr. Smith, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, at the beginning of your opening statement, as the gentleman from Georgia referred to, you were talking about the judiciary hearing that's going on in Rayburn, and you said that committee hearing is based on because the president has defied the laws of the country. Well, this committee might need to do a hearing because there's this law called the Congressional Budget Accountability Act of 1974. And I would say that the Budget Committee and the Democrat-controlled Congress has not passed a budget according to the laws of the country. So I refer that maybe a hearing of defying the laws of the country should be done in this committee. Tomorrow will mark 100 days. 100 days since the deadline to complete a budget defying the laws of the country. Tomorrow's 100 days. Under a Democrat majority, hearings on climate change are now more common at the Budget Committee than hearings on the actual budget. Sadly, at this point, the budget process has mostly passed this committee by. On the floor later this week, we'll likely consider a 2-year agreement that would increase spending by $320 billion, less than 1/4 of which is offset. The agreement would raise the baseline for future spending by nearly $2 trillion. On top of that, with this new agreement, Democrats likely won't do a budget next year either, further abandoning the sole responsibility of this committee. That being said, I understand the reluctance of Democrat members of this committee to talk about the Green New Deal, as I refer to as the Green New Disaster. But without a budget, the Green New Disaster is the only comprehensive plan Democrats have put forward to show their visions for this country. And it truly is a comprehensive vision. A statement from the office of one of the chief authors confirmed it about it's more than climate change. Quote, "It wasn't originally a climate thing at all. We really think of it as how do you change the entire economy thing," close quotes. So 12 Democrat members of this committee are co-sponsors of this resolution, which according to the authors is an economy-altering vision. We don't have a budget for this year and likely won't have one next year either. With all that in mind, I don't see how we can avoid talking about the Green New Disaster. We can't avoid talking about the fact that the estimated cost per household will be over $60,000 a year. In my congressional district, the median income household for a family of 4 is $40,000 a year. Think about that. Given that in 2017, U.S. carbon emissions were at their lowest since 1992 without eliminating air travel or cows, such as suggested by the Green New Disaster. And that China and India alone were responsible for almost half of the increase in global emissions that same year. I think my colleagues will agree that the cost hardly seems worth it. In fact, the EPA just released a report showing how much U.S. air quality has improved over the last 44 years. The findings show that during that time, emissions from the 6 common pollutants dropped by 74%, all while American energy consumption increased. Mr. Powell, Democrats' preferred solutions, like the Green New Disaster or a carbon tax, would hit rural communities like the ones I represent very hard. If we have the move to 100% renewables, what would that mean for consumers? How would that impact rural communities that I represent?
I think you'd first have to ask Congressman whether a move to 100% renewables is even possible. Many studies have shown that that's a virtually impossible proposition for our power sector. But if you did believe it was possible and the investments were required, it's likely that it would very significantly increase electricity prices, which is completely unnecessary when we think about getting the power grid down to very low emissions. We can leverage other technologies like advanced nuclear energy, fossils with carbon capture, grid-scale storage, combined with some more renewables, and we can do it in a much cheaper fashion and a much more reliable fashion for consumers.
The gentleman's time has expired. I now recognize the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Sears, for 5 minutes.
Good morning, and thank you, Chairman, and thank you, our witnesses, for being here today. I represent a district in New Jersey across from the Empire State Building. Basically, it's the 8th district. It's a very, very complex district in terms of transportation network. And it's very susceptible to the rising sea levels. During Sandy, we got hit very, very hard. We're still feeling the impact of that. The Gateway Tunnel was flooded with salt water. Now the cement on it has been eroded by the salt. This was supposed to be this once in a century superstorm. There seems to be more than just one nowadays. I mean, we just got hit yesterday hard again with a big storm with a lot of floods in my district. So can you speak to the increase in weather events which continue in similar manners? I mean, I assume that these are going to be more and more often, the kind of storms that we're going to be seeing.
Thanks, sir. You're exactly right. This is one of the significant impacts of a changing climate is as we warm the earth, we increase the water cycle, we supercharge it. So that what might have been a 1 in 100 or 1 in 500 storm now becomes a 1 in 20 or a 1 in 50 storm. All over the country, we are setting records for rainfall intensity, flash floods. I call them rain bombs, in which you talk to any local officials and they say, we've never seen this before. And then 3 years later, they say, we've never seen it before again. And these are the things that we're going to have to deal with in our infrastructure. And how do we build systems that can deal with these, while at the same time, it's not either or, but while at the same time looking ahead to try to bring down the CO2 so this curve doesn't keep on going up, because we're already seeing it going up.
I mean, we spend billions of dollars after these disasters in trying to bring back the grids and the transportation systems. I must say that they're making some progress in terms of dealing with it. Now, instead of putting the switches on the floor, they're putting the switches on the ceiling. Even Public Service Electric and Gas is raising the generators before they had it just covered with chain link fences. Can you imagine? So I'm a strong supporter of pre-disaster mitigation. What can we do in areas like mine? I know people talk about a wall all along the river. Well, that doesn't really, residents don't really care for that because they like to look at the view in New York, and there have been millions and millions of dollars invested along the waterfront in my district, which is called the Gold Coast now. And I don't know if a wall would be, what else can be done? What kind of projects? How do we mitigate some of these things? Does anybody have any idea?
Thank you, Mr. Saras. And I will say that I was a part of the Navy's response to Hurricane Sandy, in particular in your area, and so have some modest familiarity with the challenges that you're facing. What will be a challenge for your district as well as coastal Virginia is that we will have to come up with a range of solutions. And the challenge there for us, at least, is to understand what infrastructure is critical and what infrastructure is critical that is also vulnerable to rising waters, and then evaluate what are the best solutions. Are they hard solutions, which are costly and run the risk of not being high enough under some circumstances? Or are they softer solutions, green infrastructure solutions that will delay impacts over time? Or are they solutions where we restructure how our communities look, we move people away from the water, give them more elevation elsewhere, and give them different choices for how they live in an area where they clearly want to be, but in a way that is safer for them and less impactful on the infrastructure over time that will be required to harden them to allow them to remain in place right now. So there's a series of choices. The green choices, the hardening choices, and then there is always the option to restructure your community to relocate people so that they are not in harm's way all of the time or are in harm's way less of the time so that your infrastructure can support them.
Gentleman's time has
My time
expired.
is up. Thank you.
Thank you. I now recognize the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Muser, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all for being here with us, which is an important subject. It is a shame, however, to have an opening political statement made here professing as a fact that the President of the United States defied the law without any proof or due process. Such statements may lead some people here to think that some on this dais attended the Fidel Castro School of Law. But back to what we're here for, to discuss this important issue. The private sector, state governments as well as county facilities, are already working to be very innovative and reduce emissions at their own pace. I find it to be a relatively rapid pace. We are seeing the benefits. The U.S. is leading, according to some recent data and reports, reducing greenhouse gases more so than any other country that was in the data pool, which was quite a lot. This data is factual. In fact, China and India, who are part of the Paris Climate Accord, are responsible for almost half of the increases in global carbon emissions. So businesses in my district sort of get it. It's a very positive thing for their employees, for the community. Along with it being a positive feel-good thing, it's saving them money. They're finding it some great efficiencies. As a matter of fact, Fort Indian Town Gap, a very large Army training facility in my district, home of the Pennsylvania National Guard in Lebanon County, uses both solar panels and geothermal HVAC for the system to lower costs and increase efficiencies in a high percentage of their overall energy use. So we must look at trends and be data-driven, realistic, and also be economically feasible in our solutions. And that's what we all should be here to try to find, solutions. So I'd like to start, Mr. Powell, with you. Are you finding American business trends to be in line with what I'm saying and become more efficient, more green, and more cost-effective?
Well, first, thank you for the question. It's always great to discuss these issues with a fellow Northeastern Pennsylvanian. I think we are absolutely seeing remarkable commitments from the private sector on this. If you just take a look at the utility power generation sector alone, in the past year, we've had a remarkable set of commitments from major utilities to get to 80% or even 100% emissions reductions by the middle of the century. If you look at companies like Xcel and AEP and Southern Company and many others. I think at this point, the Edison Electric Institute estimates that its utility members will have decreased their emissions by 50% by 2030 through the use of new technology and through the switch from coal to natural gas in many cases.
So do you have data as to whether or not the private sector or government mandates are making stronger strides?
Well, right now, if you look at what's decarbonized the U.S. power sector, in the past 10 years, it's down about 30%. And of that 30% reduction, about 2/3 of that does come from the switch of some coal to some natural gas. Most of that, at this point, is a market-driven sort of private sector decision. It's just simply a better, cheaper technology to use natural gas. Now, that was because of significant federal investments in the natural gas space that were made in the 80s and late 90s. There was a lot of federal basic and applied R&D, about $500 million through the Office of Fossil Energy. There was a public-private partnership with Mitchell Energy down in Texas, and there was about a $6 billion targeted tax incentive, the alternative production credit, which helped that industry scale up. But then we found this better mousetrap. We found a technology that was cleaner and cheaper and better performing than the alternatives, and the private sector's picked it up.
Yeah, by all means, and who would be against such public-private partnerships that actually do work out for the long term? Do you find something like the Green New Deal, a huge government, multi-trillion-dollar mandate, to be something that will be worthwhile?
When we think about climate policy, we think it's got to pass 3 tests, sort of technical feasibility, political sustainability, and global impact. And unfortunately, I don't think the Green New Deal passes any of those tests.
Okay, and what countries are as focused as we are, as the United States is, on private sector innovation and where the trends are equally positive?
We're doing pretty well. There aren't as many countries doing better than us. I will say the United Kingdom has a pretty good track, and it's because they're pursuing an all-of-the-above clean energy approach. They've got a big program in renewables. They've got a big program in nuclear energy. They're experimenting with clean fossil fuels and carbon capture. They have a commitment to hydropower, especially in the north. They're using everything.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield.
Okay, gentleman's time has expired, and now recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. Panetta, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate this opportunity. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your testimony, for your participation in this very important hearing, as well as your preparation for it. I know it's taken a lot for you to get here, but thank you very much for everything that you have done and will continue to do, especially in this area, addressing climate change. Once again, my name is Jimmy Panetta. I'm from the Central Coast of California, 20th Congressional District, otherwise known, as many people will tell you that I often say, the salad bowl of the world. So we have a lot of agriculture, and I think it's clear that you understand how important agriculture is, especially in dealing with the effects of climate change and basically working to deal with that issue as well, and how they can contribute to reducing the carbon output when it comes to agriculture and certain steps that they can take. Obviously, being an agricultural district, the Salinas Valley is very vulnerable as well, though, to climate change. At the same time, it's one of the few sectors that, like I said, has potential for significant increases in carbon sequestration to offset greenhouse gas pollution. I think we understand, and clearly your testimony demonstrates that we need to think about the adverse impacts on agriculture, along with the unique role that agriculture can play when it comes to addressing climate change. And so I'll start with Ms. Grant, along those lines, what is the potential for regenerative agriculture and new approaches to soil carbon management to simultaneously improve productivity and mitigate climate change?
Thank you for the question. Regenerative agriculture is something that's actually been around for quite a while. It's not necessarily a new technology. If you want to go back, it's going back to some of the older practices that have been out there for a number of years and kind of looking back to see what's worked and what hasn't. And it's really focused on not disturbing the soil, keeping roots and cover on the soil and making sure you don't have that erosion and that soil can actually keep the water in. If we get these huge rainfall events, that it can actually take the rain, pull it in, hold it in. So when you get the drought conditions in California, the water is there for the continued crops to grow and such like that. In addition, then these are also pulling the soil, or the soil is able to hold more carbon, which is, as you were referring to, can hold down that carbon and reduce. Agriculture can be a really big key player in all of this. Currently we're seeing a lot of issues around the sense of farmers. It's a new practice. It's different from what they've been used to. And it takes a really big mindset change for farmers to do this. So some of the regulations, crop insurance is set up in such a way that it's not advantageous to make these. You could actually risk defaulting on your crop insurance by doing some of these practices the way RMA regulates it today. And so those are a number of things we think, getting farmers out there to understand it better, to work together and learn from each other on it is a big key of this, and it's really a path forward in our view.
In regards to that, how can obviously having these types of discussions, getting them talking about it, the knowledge about it, in that sense, what role can the federal government play in order to further this conversation and actually lead to steps that our people in ag can take?
The conservation title that was funded in the last Farm Bill took a step of the way there, but I think really focusing on being able farmers to test out these practices. You're not going to go in and do all these practices on, if you've got a 500-acre farm, you're not going to do this on all 500 acres. Farmers want to go in and test this on 40 acres, test it out, see what works, learn from it, and then slowly expand it out. And so it's going to be a time and a process. So funding to be able to do that, because I've had a farmer tell me for cover crops, for example, he was a second year of farming, and he told me, I don't want to try them because I'm afraid I'm going to screw up my cash crop. So what we actually did as a company, we're funding the cost of the cover crops for 2 years for him to say, go in and try it on 40 acres, and we'll cover that cost, so you're not out at least the $40 an acre to try it. And you can learn from it and hopefully expand it on. Those are the types of things, having the technical assistance for farmers to be able to understand that. So that's why funding the National Resource Conservation Service offices and the field offices, having people in those offices to help provide that technical assistance, providing the grants and the programs, whether it's public-private partnerships, companies such as ourselves putting our own cost share in on these, bringing together government, putting those together to help keep farmers whole as they try these and learn and being able to take this. And the biggest thing that government can do is stop looking at this as a great conservation practice. This is a nice thing to do. No, these are good farming practices, and that's how the government should look at these, and that's how USDA should be talking about these instead of, oh, it's a nice conservation practice to do.
Fair enough. Thank you, Ms. Grant. Thanks to all the witnesses. I yield back.
The gentleman's time has expired. I now recognize the gentleman from Oklahoma, Mr. Hearn, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Womack, for having this hearing today, and I especially want to thank Admiral Phillips and Admiral Titli for your service beyond what you're doing today. Thank you for being engaged in protecting our country as we go forward. Climate change must be addressed without sacrificing our country's economic and fiscal well-being with destructive policies like the Green New Deal, with an undisputed cost of $93 trillion and a regressive carbon tax. And the social proposals that are included in that Green New Deal, as my colleagues have talked about, and the carbon tax are costly and will have devastating effects on energy reliability and economic growth. Not only would these proposals be disastrous for the economy, energy reliability, and our national security, they'd cause American households to face skyrocketing utility bills. According to an MIT study, a 100% renewable energy grid would cost American households $150 to $300 per megawatt hour. In 2017, the average electric bill was $111. A fully renewable electricity system would require a 286% cost increase, resulting in electric bills up to $3,882, higher than their current average cost. This would adversely affect poorer communities who already have trouble paying their utility costs. Low-income households will be the hardest hit, as they already spend nearly 3 times as much of their income on electricity costs when compared to higher-income households. Effectively, Democrat plans such as the carbon tax and the Green New Deal would cause hardworking Americans to choose between the ability to feed their families or paying their utility bills and filling their car's gas tank, thereby doing irreversible damage to vulnerable communities. Furthermore, to achieve our clean energy goals, we should encourage innovation in the natural gas industry. Natural gas is far cleaner than coal and oil and has become extremely plentiful in America over the past decade. Natural gas is poised to become one of the world's most dominant energy sources and has drastically cut Americans' emission levels to those not seen in decades. The United States is now the leading producer of natural gas in the world. Lowering regulatory hurdles to increase liquefied natural gas exports would spur our nation's economy, meet global energy demand, and help other nations hit their climate goals with cleaner burning natural gas, thereby lowering emissions globally, not just here at home. If Democrats really support lowering global emissions, they should also support the use of natural gas, as it would help to achieve the environmental results that we all desire. That said, my questions are directed at you, Mr. Powell. Do you think natural gas, I think you stated this, but do you think natural gas is the solution to addressing climate change?
I do. It has been the most important solution in the United States over the past decade.
So what are the benefits?
A few. First, natural gas-fired power plants are simply cheaper to operate than most other power plants today, so they sort of set the standard price in the wholesale power markets. And we appear to have a virtually infinite supply of low-cost natural gas in this country.
So it wouldn't surprise you, as my colleagues mentioned a minute ago, we're all used to asking these questions. While that may not have occurred in this committee, because of every committee that we're on, we're all asking these questions across all committees, and we're getting various answers, but answers that support the next conversation I'm going to talk to you about. It's members across the aisle are trying to do everything possible to prevent, as example, in the Permian Basin in Texas, to getting natural gas out of the ground into our terminals in Houston by blocking pipelines, by preventing us from transporting on rail, and making it extraordinarily difficult. And the need of this is to get natural gas to container ships, to get them to Europe, to get them to China, to help them also offset and lower their CO2 emissions. Yet you would think they'd want to be a part of that, except it's been very distracting in trying to make that happen. How has natural gas affected U.S. emissions over time?
So U.S. emissions are down about 2/3 in the power sector, and about 1/3 of the power sector, and about 2/3 of that is from natural gas. But that doesn't even take into account the benefits they've had, to your point, from global exports. So when we send a shipment of LNG to Poland, for example, and help them start to transition their grid, or send a shipment to China and help them stop using so much coal just to heat their homes around Beijing, that's also a significant decrease to global emissions. We often don't get credit sort of for that part of the picture as well.
It also has a geopolitical problem. If you talk about Germany, and the President addressed this in the NATO conversations, if you're buying natural gas from Russia, we should be able to supply that. We have a plentiful supply. So we can change those geopolitical positions if we're able to supply this very plentiful energy we have. I want to thank you for your answers. I want to thank all of you for being here today and addressing this issue. I think we have a free market, free enterprise solutions that we can continue to move through. The customers demand it. We will continue to evolve as we have done in the past. And I really appreciate we don't need the holistic, dramatic changes that's being proposed on the other side. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
The gentleman's time has expired, and now yield 5 minutes to the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Kildee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I thank the witnesses for your testimony and for being here. I'm from Michigan. I represent a district in Michigan with 119 miles of shoreline along the shore of Lake Huron. And so we see climate change through that lens. It's directly affecting the Great Lakes. That hurts Michigan's economy, and that hurts our job growth. Increasing temperatures cause extreme weather, in our case, harmful algal blooms, and declining cold water fish populations have hurt tourism and our fishing industries. So there's a real economic impact. And furthermore, water level changes, severe water level changes, affect trade and shipping as cargo ships have to adjust their trips within the lake. So I believe that for the people I represent, we actually have to do a lot more. I do hear a lot of folks say that in general we need to do something about it, but seem to object to every specific suggestion that comes up. I think one area where we can do a lot more is incentivizing both individual and business behavior through the tax code. We focused a lot on credits, tax credits for renewable energy development and encouraging energy efficiency through pushing for cleaner vehicles, because the transportation sector is the largest source of greenhouse gas emissions in the U.S., which is obviously a direct driver of climate change. So one way to reduce these greenhouse gases and their impact on the environment is incentivizing more people to drive electric vehicles, for example, thus reducing their pollutants and negative health impacts from the exhaust from carbon-based vehicles. So that's one of the reasons that I have taken action to introduce legislation, the Driving America Forward Act, which has both support from environmental and health groups as well as auto companies to incentivize more electric vehicles. So I have a question, because very often we focus on the price of policy, and there's been some pushback even on the efforts that I have around electric vehicles, because there's a price to it. So I guess I have a question for Dr. Benjamin. If you could address, and you may have already touched upon this, we've got a lot going on today, as you might know. We've been coming and going. But if you could talk about the negative health impacts that are traceable to emissions from gasoline vehicles, especially in vulnerable populations.
You know, it's really a challenge. So I grew up in Chicago, and you know, when I was growing up, we had all the projects living right along the Dan Ryan Expressway, and we now know that those populations were at extraordinary risk from the particulate matter and the emissions from cars. It results in problems with women in pregnancy. It results in challenges for children, low birth weight babies, a whole range of activity around lung function and lung development.
So exposure to those emissions obviously has a health implication that affects everyone who's exposed to it, but in many cases disproportionately affects people who are already living in challenged circumstances, particularly in poverty.
Yeah, the closer you are, the more you're impacted, and those places tend to be in communities of low-income communities.
So this gets to the issue of the price of something versus the cost of not doing anything. There's a cost associated, there's a human cost, obviously, associated with those health implications that you can't put a dollar figure on, but you can put a dollar figure on some of it. I'm not asking you to give me a precise number, but just to speculate on the fact that there are costs associated with emissions that impact health in human beings that society, and for that matter, government actually bears. Would you agree with that?
It's billions of dollars, and we pay through our health insurance dollars each and every day.
So we really all pay for the implication. We pay for the fact that we're not doing enough to stem emissions that have health implications. It would seem logical to accept the fact that there's going to have to be some kind of a way that we minimize those emissions, even if there's a price associated with it. The net effect is certainly worth the investment. Would you agree with that?
It's always more expensive to take care of someone who is sick than taking care of someone as well. The best way to reduce costs in the Medicare program is not to put sick people in it to begin with.
Amen. Well, thank you very much. I thank the witnesses for your testimony. I thank the chairman for holding this hearing, and I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. Now recognize the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Crenshaw, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all for being here. Some really knowledgeable people in here telling us some very good information. And a lot of it we already know. Climate change is real and we need to address it. And the question is, how do we do that? And what is next? How? We have proven ways of decreasing emissions, decreasing costs, increasing access, and increasing our GDP all at the same time. We've talked about some of those already. I think we should support all ways of decreasing emissions, from traditional renewables to cleaned up fossil fuels to nuclear to innovative new tech like carbon capture. The other side often would make us think that there's only one way to address it: solar, wind, Green New Deal, which really isn't a climate solution at all, even by the admission of its own authors. It's a socialist takeover of the economy, as they stated. We should be talking about actual solutions. Solutions to climate change are not all or nothing, it's all of the above. It's not one solution, it's many. We are the party of solutions, and a truly sustainable clean energy plan is the sum of many solutions, not one at the cost of all others, to include economic growth. I want to talk about the legislation we recently dropped last week, the Leading Act. Carbon capture is one of these clean energy solutions. It takes the emissions created by power generation and it captures them. The beautiful thing is, here in America, we actually have a market for that waste, the waste being carbon. There are already companies buying and selling carbon dioxide for energy production, for manufacturing, for construction, for food and drink, and now even for new forms of plastic that are biodegradable. So rather than eliminating our main power source, which is fossil fuels, we found a way to, 1, make them clean, and 2, keep them cheap, and 3, use the waste. Net Power, this is a plant in Houston, it's a natural gas power plant near Houston. It does this very thing. It captures the carbon produced from power generation, uses the carbon to power the plant, and then sells the rest. We're actually recycling it. So rather than selling and trading vouchers for how much carbon you've produced, essentially the cap and trade system, Net Power is selling carbon itself. It's reducing emissions, keeping energy cheap, exporting this technology to the biggest emitters, China and India. This is one of the reasons that Mr. Flores and I introduced the Leading Act, putting more money into carbon capture R&D, specifically for natural gas power plants. I want to start with Mr. Powell. In your testimony, you discussed the broad suite of policies: innovation, investments, financing, regulatory reform. The 45Q tax credit plus Leading Act seems like that type of package. What else can we do to accelerate carbon capture technologies?
Well, first, Congressman, thank you for your leadership on the Leading Act and your co-sponsorship of the Use It Act, also an important measure in the carbon capture space, and the BEST Act, an important measure in the energy innovation space. I think you're leading across a whole suite of clean innovation in these technologies. When we think about carbon capture, right, probably the most important thing we can do after first the passage of the 45Q tax credit by the last Congress, which is a very significant new incentive for this technology, and the demonstrations of new natural gas power plants that would be done by the Leading Act, I think the next most important thing we have to make sure is that these things are all implemented correctly. So the regulations, for example, around how the 45Q credit can be captured, we need to make sure that the monitoring, reporting, and verification rules, we're kind of getting deep into the IRS and EPA regs, but making sure that those are done well so that as broad a swath of companies as possible can take advantage of those incentives.
I appreciate that. And I guess along those same lines, can you briefly touch on why net power could be such a game changer? Is this the type of technology that we must commercialize to offer the developing world both clean and cheap energy?
Absolutely. If you think about net power, they've completely reinvented carbon capture. They've turned the carbon from a bug into a feature of the cycle.
Right.
And so some other amazing things about that technology, not only is it about as cheap as a traditional natural gas power plant, so basically it's no additional cost for something that's zero emissions. Not only does it give you this stream of CO2 that's already at pressure, which you can sell for enhanced oil recovery or other things, but because it never uses water in the first place, it's a thermal power plant that doesn't use any water. That's an extraordinary thing. You could put it in the middle of a big city. It has no other air emissions like NOx or SOx.
Right.
You could put it in the middle of a non-attainment zone. That's a game changer.
And I think it's important to note that it's a game changer for 100% of the problem. When you're talking about the Green New Deal, you're talking about 15% of the problem because the U.S. emits 15% of emissions. Well, when you're talking about carbon dioxide emissions, you have to focus on the entire globe. And new technology coming out of the greatest innovation machine the world has ever known, which is the United States of America, that's how we fix this problem, 100% of the problem. Thank you.
The gentleman's time has expired. I now recognize the gentleman from New York, Mr. Morelli, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I do want to thank you for holding this hearing. This is the second hearing on the budgetary impacts of climate change, and I can't imagine a more important topic, so I want to thank you. I want to thank all the witnesses who I think have added a great deal to our understanding of the challenges that we face. I would associate my remarks some with Mr. Kildee did. I represent Rochester, New York, which is on the southern shore of Lake Ontario, and during the last hearing focused a number of my comments and questions related to resiliency. We do an awful lot using federal and state dollars to deal with the disaster after it's happened, as people have talked about, and I appreciate in particular your comments, Admiral Phillips, on the need to build resiliency, mitigation. We need to be forward thinking, and I often say that when it comes to these types of natural disasters, and I'm on an interior coast, that it's not a question of if, but when. And we're seeing, obviously, 100-year storms happening with greater regularity. So I appreciate that, and I did talk about that in the last one. I wanted to talk a little bit today about some of the health impacts, particularly the public health impacts, and perhaps Dr. Benjamin, like Mr. Kildee, one of the lakes in my community, Hemlock Lake in upstate New York, which is the primary source of drinking water for the city of Rochester, has now reported blue-green algae blooms for the third time in as many years. I wonder, and I'm not sure, I must admit, as a layperson, what the potential impact is of green algae blooms in drinking water or water supplies. Can you comment on that?
Sure. You know, it has a range of impacts. Number one, you can't drink the water. Number two, you can't swim in the water. And then your state or local health department has to go out there, of course, and engage at some cost to, test the water, make sure it's clean. And then there's obviously activities to try to make sure that the water is safe for people to utilize. So it's
And that's, may I interrupt? And that's because of the toxicity of the
toxicity of the algae blooms.
Of that particular algae. I appreciate that.
It depends which one it is, but yeah.
Correct. You mentioned, too, the cost of asthma, and I wondered, you mentioned a number, and I apologize, I was looking through your testimony to see if I could grab it. I thought you said 56 billion, is that right? I'm sorry.
That was for all of healthcare costs. That's a Chris Ebby study, but the asthma one, I'll get it back to you. I have to find it in my testimony.
Yeah, it was a significant number. I wondered whether or not you have looked at that trend line over the last several decades and whether the incidence of childhood asthma and other respiratory illnesses have changed dramatically, and whether you link those directly to changes in climate. Is there data which supports that?
Yeah, well, the asthma number is 56 billion, but that's for all asthma.
Okay,
We know that
that was right.
asthma,
Okay.
the incidence of asthma is growing, and it's growing for a variety of reasons. But certainly, climate change and increase in pollen is certainly one of them.
Gotcha. The other thing I wanted to ask about, if in upstate New York, one of the things that's gaining significant attention over the last decade, and I don't remember this growing up in upstate New York, but is the incidence of Lyme disease and neurological impacts of Lyme disease, which are becoming more and more talked about. I wonder if you could talk about that. And I understand it has something to do with the migratory patterns of ticks as they move further south as the temperatures increase. I wonder if you could comment on if you have any information relative to the patterns of ticks, and also whether there's changes in the types of, in the acuity of Lyme disease over time as well.
Sure. So we're seeing kind of a couple patterns. Number one, we're seeing the environments in which tick-borne diseases occur changing as we're getting wetter and warmer. And so we're seeing a lot of the mosquito-borne diseases that occurred primarily in warm parts of the country move up and out. If you simply just remember the West Nile virus outbreak that we had, and you just follow that pattern, New York, down the coast of the United States, and then westward. We're now seeing dengue, malaria, and other things that have not really usually impacted the United States now going upward. And that's because we're getting wetter and warmer, and our seasons are changing. And so we're going to see more and more of those exposures to people with the resulting health impacts. Lyme disease is a little complicated in a variety of ways. Number one, it's why it's not really that difficult to diagnose. It's often missed for a whole range of reasons. And it's also easy to treat, but again, we prefer not to have to treat it in the first place.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
That gentleman's time has expired, and now recognize the gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Burchett, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member. Appreciate y'all being here. As I mentioned in previous hearings this committee held on climate change, East Tennessee, I feel like, is leading the way with nuclear energy, or nuclear energy, whichever the case may be. I believe that nuclear power is one of the best ways to reduce our carbon footprint while also being fiscally responsible. One piece of nuclear technology I'm fascinated with is small modular reactors. Mr. Powell, are you familiar with small modular reactors?
First, let me recognize the great state of Tennessee's strong leadership in nuclear energy innovation with the Oak Ridge National Laboratory.
I will take full credit for it, and I have nothing to do with it. Other than my father was on Okinawa, and they were fixing to invade Japan, and they dropped the bombs. And
I think you should take full credit.
yes,
I'm very familiar
then
with
I will,
reactors.
thank you. Yep. I will. This town is full of people taking credit for something they had absolutely nothing to do with, and I will step right in front of that line then. Thank you, sir. I suspect that'll make the news since there's nothing else going on at the Capitol today. Well, could you tell me where you stand with this technology?
Strongly supportive of small modular reactors, or SMRs. They will be a game changer for nuclear the way something like net power is for natural gas.
Yes, sir. And ma'am, this isn't in my notes, and it always makes my staff nervous, and I'm sure that they're all in my office crowding around the television. Uh-oh, what's he getting ready to say? But I'm an organic gardener. Mainly my groundhogs end up eating all my produce this year because I have not been home to it. But I wish you would comment on the fact that I think that all of us can do something. There's some young folks in here, and I compost. I compost over half of our waste stream. I hate to call it waste stream because it's really not. I mean, they're biodegradable. God put all this bacteria in the world that can change it into something wonderful, and the worms do the rest of it. And I would hope that you would encourage folks, maybe if you could say something to these young people about, we can do something. Congress isn't going to do anything. We're going to sit up here and have all these crazy hearings, and it's just like that TV show on Netflix about, what's the name of that show? House of Cards. It's just like that, except on that TV show, they actually passed some meaningful legislation. I don't expect this Congress to do anything. But I wish you would comment on that. Not on Netflix, but on the other.
Which is good, because I have to admit, I've never actually watched the show.
Good.
Much to my husband's chagrin, probably. Absolutely, everyone can do something, and whether it's all starting small, it's in our backyards, it's in our own gardens and what we do. I also compost at home, and that goes into my garden. That's pathetic as ever also with that. But, you know, we actually do support a lot of urban gardening also, and trying to get that into the inner cities, and trying to make sure that it's not just, you know, the rural America, but everybody needs to be able to experience and have access to healthy, nutritious food.
And, you know, when we set stuff on the curb, and I rail on this all the time, but it goes to the landfill, and it decomposes anaerobically in the absence of oxygen, and it puts off a very harmful gas, which is methane. And when you compost it aerobically in your backyard, you don't have, there are some gases, but it's not quite as much detriment to the environment. So I would hope you all would encourage that in everything you do.
Thank you.
Yes, sir. I'm sorry. Yes, sir.
I would just say, sir, plug for where I live in central Pennsylvania in State College, we have curbside organic composting. So we just throw it all in one bin, and it actually does get composted, not thrown into the landfill. And maybe there's some way of encouraging more communities to do the same. It's so easy, even I can do it.
Yes, sir. Well, I appreciate that. And as I've encouraged some of my friends across the aisle that maybe sometimes the big government approach isn't the best. I always I like it in the hands of us regular folks. So, but I appreciate that, and I appreciate all the folks up here that served our country. Thank you all very much, and I'll yield back the rest of my time, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the gentleman. I'm just so sad to see that you've become so cynical in such a short period
Yes,
of
sir.
time.
Well, no, I came up here cynical, sir. The biggest surprise I had when I got up here was that I was not surprised.
Appreciate the gentleman.
Thank you, sir.
I now recognize a gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Price, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to this panel. Ms. Grant, as the business person in the group and someone who knows about the national and international business community, I'm going to direct this to you, but invite others to chime in. You know, in our politics, we often use the term special interests, and it's often used in a negative way. We often are referring to business interests or other interests that supposedly control our politics. But, you know, when it comes to climate change, it strikes me that narrative doesn't quite do the job. And I want to ask you about that. Businesses haven't asked for a lot of the anti-environmental measures that this administration has taken. In fact, the vast majority of businesses seem to be committed to tackling climate change. 189 of the U.S.'s largest companies have committed to go 100% renewable by 2050 at the latest. After Donald Trump decided to pull out of the Paris Accord, Unilever, along with a diverse coalition of companies, including BP, PG&E, General Mills, Walmart, Microsoft, all urged President Trump to stay in the accord. And for that matter, the auto manufacturers didn't ask for a reduction in fuel efficiency standards, or they certainly weren't the ones driving that. Many energy companies, many power companies didn't request the rollback of the Clean Power Plan. So what's going on exactly? The special interest narrative doesn't quite do it. My understanding is that businesses want certainty provided by a governmental reliance on sound science and thoughtfully implemented regulations where the path forward is clear. But at every turn, Trump's actions have created uncertainty. Capricious trade tactics, dismantling of environmental protections, the rejection of science and international cooperation. All of these have significant implications for how industries address climate change and succeed in a global economy. So that's my question to you. Do you think this is just a matter of special interests? Is he listening to businesses even when he crafts these policies? If not, what possibly is driving these actions? And how has the uncertainty created by Trump made it more expensive, more difficult for businesses like Unilever to meet your climate goals, to compete internationally, to effectively enact preventive measures?
There's a lot in that question, Congressman. You know, climate change for us, and I think for most businesses, is if you sit down and look at it, it's a risk to our ability to continue operating. I mean, we look at this on an annual basis, and we constantly review, consider, and assess, and we've even run high-level assessments on, you know, if we've a 2 degree Celsius warming or 4 degree Celsius global warming scenarios, what does that do for our business? And agreed, you will see us, we are members of Ceres, we are still in the Sustainable Food Policy Alliance, and we're all saying something needs to be done. We're pushing government to do it. We will continue to push and do as much as we can, but to your point, we need definitely, we ask government to put a policy out there, lead, you know, tell us where you want us to be and help us get there. We can't all do it by ourselves, but in the meantime, we'll take the lead on it.
Do you have any plausible explanation for why the views of the business community were so blithely ignored in this instance?
I have no idea, Congressman.
Anybody else?
Well, it's clear that at least the American Public Health Association supports every single one of the regulatory rollbacks that the Environmental Protection Agency has done. And we don't have a clue why they're doing it. It makes no sense, but they certainly haven't listened to the public health community's voice and the health community's voice on this. And quite frankly, we're seeing them in court because we do think it's a threat to their health. And we also recognize that we are a special interest, but our special interest is your health. And that's not a partisan issue.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman's time has expired. I now recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. Khanna, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I was struck, Mr. Powell, when you were asked about who our competitor for renewable energy may be, that you cited Great Britain. I was wondering whether that was stuck in the 19th century as opposed to the 21st century, or maybe you were energized by Prime Minister Johnson's "we're going to rally the country dude" speech. But when you look at the statistics, I mean, Britain has got, about $2.5 trillion GDP. China has a $12 trillion GDP. China is at about 60% of solar capacity, 50% of electric vehicle capacity. Probably our biggest competitor, the only country that's ahead of the United States. And then you may have India with the growth. And then the entire European Union, not Britain, is below those 3 countries. So don't you think that the real competition for the United States isn't Britain or a peer competitor, but it's China?
So certainly China is our competitor in exports of these technologies to the rest of the world. They've recognized that technologies like solar and like electric vehicles will in the future have a significant global market and geopolitical advantage, and they've decided to invest deeply in those technologies to gain an edge ahead of the United States. I would argue now that our national priority ought to be identifying the next suite of technologies where we can get back ahead. It's hard for me to believe we can catch China in manufacturing solar panels, but maybe we can get ahead in next generation solar like perovskites that are actually being tested and printed in upstate New York.
Do you think one bipartisan goal for the country should be that we seek to win the clean energy race, just like after Sputnik, we wanted to make sure America was #1 in the space race? Even if we may have disagreements on climate change, do you think there's any person in this country who wouldn't want to make sure that America led these industries of the future and not China?
I haven't met that person. I think that that would be a worthy bipartisan goal.
Thank you. Admiral Titli, thank you for your service and your constructive comments today. I know that the military has always been at the forefront of innovation, and currently there is a 25% target for renewable energy by 2025. What do you think if we upped that standard to 50% or some higher number? Do you think that our military could actually help be more aggressive in helping us meet these challenges?
Thanks for the question, Congressman. I think the military can really help, certainly within the interagency process of helping the entire federal government, both executive and legislative branches, understand that we need a global solution for this issue. Because otherwise, the military is going to keep getting called on more and more to do more and more things, which is going to cost, our budget, our taxpayers, more and more money. So where it makes sense, and we've seen numerous examples of this, where it makes cost-effective sense for the military to increase its use and usage and development of renewable energies, of so-called green energies, and I would actually prefer to say non-carbon energies, because I think there's a lot of use for small modular reactors in certain military situations, so let's say non-carbon energies. That makes tremendous sense. Having the military spend a whole ton of money, let's say that should maybe be more on the Department of Energy side, developing, let's say, some sort of non-carbon-based fuel, give that to ARPA-E. Put the money in ARPA-E's budget, give them the mission, hold them accountable, and then as that technology matures, both military and civilians can use that kind of technology. That's how I do it.
Do you think we should be increasing ARPA-E's budget and funding?
Absolutely. What are they right now? About 150 million?
Yes.
Okay, add 2 zeros. I'm serious. Add 2 zeros. Are we serious about this problem or not? When I look at the AAA.
And would you argue that would be in our national security interest?
Absolutely.
And why would it? Just explaining to folks, why do you think, I agree with you, but why do you think it would be in our national security interest?
Very simply, because if we can not only in the U.S., but then export that to the world to buy down this risk of climate change, we buy down a lot of potential stressors for instability, which means that our military has the potential of being used less. And I have yet to meet anyone in the military who wants us to be used more.
Thank you. Thank you for your service.
Thank you.
Gentleman's time has expired. Now recognize the gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Timmons, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's been an honor to serve in Congress. Being on the Budget Committee is something that I was actually excited about. Not many people say that, by the way. So I ran, one of the #1 reasons I ran for Congress was debt. $22 trillion, I said it time and again on the campaign trail, and it resonated in my district. It was literally probably the most important issue. And I want to back up real quick, and I used this on the campaign trail too. In 2010, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Admiral Michael Mullen, said to Congress, he testified, that the #1 national security threat facing our country was Congress's inability to spend within its means. At that point, we had $13 trillion of debt. It's 9 years ago. So I guess my first question is to Admiral Titli, was he wrong? Do you agree or disagree with him?
I'm not going to comment on Admiral Mullen. I think the challenge for the Congress and for the federal part is to balance. This is what you guys get paid for. This is your day job, to balance these multiple problems, whether it's climate change, whether it's migration, whether it's federal spending, and put those those types of issues together. I think whenever we try to make everything just solely one issue at the expense of everything else, we usually lose focus there. It's frankly above my pay grade to figure out what the right level of debt is. We seem to be very concerned about debt, and then we have a Republican administration that passes a huge tax cut. So this is way above my pay grade as far as figuring this out.
You know whose job it is, though? It's actually the Budget Committee's job. And here we are. I get to vote on my first major spending bill, 2 years of spending, which is likely going to pass. It never received a hearing in this room. We never talked about it. So it's likely going to pass. I'll just concede it. In 2011, Congress did just that. They said, all right, $13 trillion is a lot of debt. That's too much. So they passed a budget caps agreement to limit spending over the next decade. This expires in 2021, which again, when we vote on this spending bill this week, will literally end the budget caps agreement. So we're going to be 10 years after Congress said, we have a problem, we're spending more money than we should, and they took steps. What was accomplished? We doubled our national debt. So we're going to have $25, $26 trillion in debt at the end of this. I'm voting no this week. It's literally the number one issue I ran on. Debt, deficit spending, we need to get it under control. I don't care whose fault it is. I don't care if it's the Republicans' fault, the Democrats' fault. They're probably both to blame. It is immoral, just like it's immoral to give an environment that is degraded to my children and my grandchildren. It is equally, if not more immoral, to not have a country to give my children, my grandchildren. We are running out of time. The one good thing about this budget deal that we're about to do is that we have 2 years to figure out how we're going to right the ship, how we're going to get our spending under control, what changes have to be made, and we got to find the courage to do it. We have to find the courage within this committee, within this Congress, well, within the 117th Congress, to figure out what acceptable debt is. So, I mean, that's a great question. If at the end of this proposed deal we're voting on this week, they said, but this is the most we're going to borrow, or this is how we're going to get back within a reasonable amount of debt. Just any plan, any kind of plan, but unfortunately, plans require courage. And there's no way to fix this problem without having a little bit of courage, probably a lot of courage. So, the fact that we're here having our second hearing on climate change on the House Budget Committee that never did a hearing on the budget we're voting for this week is literally everything wrong with Washington. And we have to rise above it if we're going to save our country. I'm here to work, and I will work with anyone that's willing. And with that, I'll yield back my time.
The gentleman's time has expired. I now recognize the gentlewoman from Minnesota, Ms. Omar, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. I think saving our country means that we give care and concern to the health and the well-being of the people who live in the country. And so, Dr. Benjamin, I wanted to talk to you a little bit about your testimony in regards to how climate change is affecting our health. You talked about how, if left unchecked, it could increase illnesses and possibly cause death. The fourth National Climate Assessment released last year outlined many ways that climate change is and will continue to impair the quality and availability of drinking water supplies in the United States. It found that surface water quality is already declining as temperature increases and heavy rainfall mobilizes pollutants. Other reports have found that sodium chloride in salt that's used to de-ice roads have been found to cause lead to remove from home piping. And the Minnesota Department of Health found that removing all lead from drinking water infrastructure in my home state could cost just over $4 billion over the next 20 years, but it will save us $8 billion. That would be the benefit to the public health and its economy. So I'm wondering if you can speak to a little bit about how climate change will affect lead in our water, and should we expect a more crisis like this, the kind of crises that we're seeing in Flint?
Councilman, thank you very much, and thank you for your leadership on so many issues. Let me say that the one thing that keeps me up at night of all these climate change issues is water. It's about too much, it's about too little, and it's about contamination in both. And I know that this committee at some point is going to have a serious discussion about infrastructure. And if you think about all of our central cities and all the challenges we have at our central cities, our piping is the fact that you can turn your water pipe on and get clean water, hopefully that's safe. Each and every one of us is one of our marvels of human society, and that is at extraordinary risk. The politics, all the issues in Flint, Michigan aside, it was a fundamental failure of a range of things around technology, the public health system, but it also showed the failure of and aging of our infrastructure. We have that same problem in every central city. It doesn't get the press that it got in Flint, Michigan, but we've got to change all the piping. We've got to have the resources to do that. And as we're beginning to look at infrastructure, investment in infrastructure, we need to figure out how to do that more smartly so that every time a person turns on that water in their faucet, it'll be safe and effective. And then our folks in our rural communities have also significant challenges with well water, which isn't regulated as well in many ways as it needs to be.
I mean, I am constantly surprised that we're having conversations about clean water and access to clean water in the United States. You know, I spent 4 years in a refugee camp boiling dirty water, trying to make sure that it didn't make us sick. And every day I'm saddened that we are now living in one of the richest countries in the world. And there are people having conversations about if they can drink the water and if their kids in school might get sick because they might not know whether to drink the water or not. Admiral, you're right. It's not about focusing on one particular thing. It's about making sure that we give care and concern to all of the issues that are impacting us. And I hope that we make a decision on when do we care about the deficit. Do we care about the deficit when we're giving tax cuts to billionaires or giving welfare subsidies to the fossil fuel industry? Or do we care about deficits when we are investing in infrastructure and improving our water systems, when we're providing health care to our most vulnerable, when we are feeding our children and having proper schooling or caring for our veterans so they're not homeless and sleeping on the side of the roads? And so care and concern is something that should be a priority for all of us as we take an oath to protect and serve. And so I really do appreciate you all coming here and making sure that we give care and concern to protecting everyone in this country and providing health and security for all. Thank you. I yield back.
The gentlewoman's time has expired. I now recognize the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Johnson, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I appreciate the panel being here. I apologize for running back and forth. I'm actually have conflicting hearings today. I'm Energy and Commerce. The committee that actually has jurisdiction over this issue is having a hearing today on decarbonization and how we address that. I wish this committee would focus on its responsibility to develop a budget, but here we are. Mr. Powell, in your testimony, you mentioned the national security importance of U.S. nuclear power leadership. As you may know, Ohio is home to multiple civilian nuclear facilities like the future Piketon high-assay low-enriched uranium demonstration project. Accelerating technological innovation is important for global security, economic growth, and our environment. Additionally, at ENC last Congress, we addressed some of the issues stemming from the Part 810 process, which can affect our civil nuclear industry's ability to engage in international nuclear commerce. The geopolitical benefits of such engagement were a significant motivating factor for reforming that process. So, Mr. Powell, why is American advanced nuclear development important to global non-proliferation and climate efforts?
Well, first, Mr. Johnson, it's good to see you again. Had the honor to testify before your other committee on similar topics recently, so thank you for your continued attention to these issues. Nuclear energy, particularly advanced nuclear energy, is an extremely important national security priority. If we think about the global energy market, many countries want to develop their own energy systems and see nuclear included in that mix. And our geopolitical competitors, Russia and China, are well ahead of us in exports of nuclear. The Russian order book, I understand, is in the hundreds of billions. The Chinese order book will be in the hundreds of billions.
And they're giving low-cost financing and all kinds of things to get their foot in that door, right?
Indeed.
Is it in our strategic interest to maintain both a robust civilian and military capability, and how do those two industries, how are they intertwined?
Absolutely. This is a very interconnected ecosystem. So if you look simply at jobs for people coming out of the nuclear Navy and keeping that the most appealing part of the Navy to go into because people know that they'll have a job running a civilian reactor coming out of that, looking at the interlinked supply chains between these two things, there's so much overlap between the two industries.
Yeah, you mentioned China and Russia and others. As more of the developing world considers nuclear as part of their energy mix, commercial energy mix, we have to ask the question, why is it important for the U.S., not Russia or China, to serve as their partners? Why don't you take a crack at it, and then I'll say something.
Absolutely. Well, I think we have to remember it's not nuclear or nothing in these
Right.
countries. It's Chinese and Russian nuclear or American nuclear in these
Right.
countries. And so
Exactly.
you have to ask whether, do we trust the Chinese and Russian non-proliferation regime more than the American non-proliferation regime? I certainly don't.
Yeah, and I think it goes beyond just simple non-proliferation, because nuclear projects are century-long projects. They are, I mean, they're more than centuries. Well, that is a century. They're 100-year projects. I mean, when Russia and China get their foot in the door, they're there to stay. Operations, maintenance, upgrades, et cetera, as technology changes. Mr. Powell, the first commercial-scale U.S. coal carbon capture project, Petronova, began commercial operations in early 2017. It is designed to capture over 4,000 tons of carbon emissions from a coal plant and use those emissions to produce 15,000 barrels of American oil each day, a 50 times increase over the field's status quo. The project was made possible by the public-private partnership with the Department of Energy. The primary industry partner on the project, NRG, has stated that a second project could be done at 20 to 30% lower cost with its lessons learned. Underscoring your point of learning by doing, how can federal innovation, investment, and innovative financing policies help bring first-of-a-kind technologies like Petronova to the commercial marketplace?
So we've now entered the period with carbon capture and storage where we need to do more of these projects to bring down the cost. It's less about a breakthrough and more about, as you said, learning by doing. So things like the 45Q tax credit that would incentivize more projects so we can start to get those learnings and bring down cost are extremely important.
And there's an analogy here with commercial nuclear. As we advance in that, we can help countries like India and others that have high carbon emissions do the same thing by helping them with that technology that Russia and China is not going to do.
Absolutely.
With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. His time has expired. I now yield 10 minutes to the ranking member, Mr. Womack.
All right, thank you. And once again, I want to thank the panel for being here, and specifically I want to thank the people who have served their country in uniform, the two admirals. Dr. Benjamin, Army guy. I'm an Army guy, so. And there's one really bright spot that has come out of this hearing this morning. It's the unknown intellectual capacity of my friend Mayor Burchett from Tennessee. You know, he was using some very big words, and he was taking credit for a lot of things that he admitted he had nothing to do with. But boy, it's good to know that members on our side of the aisle have at least a command of some of that. I don't know if it's real or not. He may have just stayed in a Holiday Inn Express one night and just thinks he knows all that stuff. My colleague from South Carolina talked a lot about the budget, and some of the other members have talked about the lack of a budget. I empathize with my friend, the chairman here from Louisville, Kentucky, because I've been in his seat before, and I know what it's like to have to bring diverse thought processes around trying to get a budget out of this committee. Now, we were able to get it out of committee. We just never got it to the floor. He was unable to get it out of committee, and I empathize with that because it's part of our Article I duty, and I'm sorry that we're abdicating that duty. But Mr. Timmons talked about some numbers, and this is one of the things that I think America needs to understand and have a complete grasp of, because we're about to have a couple of days of extremely intense discussions about how we fund the U.S. government beginning on October 1st against the backdrop of a law, the Budget Control Act, that dictates and triggers a sequester should we not be able to come to some agreement on caps. And the inescapable fact is that as a percentage of our economy, discretionary spending, and that includes the spending that has been the subject of a lot of this discussion today, is going down. And as a percentage of our economy, mandatory spending vested in some very large programs is going higher. When I ran for this office, the discretionary budget of the United States of America was over $1.3 trillion. Today, the number we will be arguing vehemently about is a little over $1.3 trillion. And we are 10 years down the road. I think it was Admiral, how do you say it, Titli? Admiral Titli wasn't it you that talked about ARPA-E? I'm a fan of ARPA-E. Not because I happen to know Arun Mujumdar very well on a personal basis, but because I also recognize, I like the model. The model was we take some of this crazy research and we incubate it because nobody else is going to do it, and then we hand it off, so to speak, to the private sector to develop and turn into great technology for our country. So, but again, ARPA-E is one of those agencies that gets its money out of the discretionary budget of the United States. So, you know, Chairman, I think our country is just not having that conversation. We're focused on simple math about blowing holes in deficits, and we know we got $1 trillion deficit, and we know we got a $22 trillion debt, and we know what net interest on the debt is. It's going to be $1 billion a day, a little over $1 billion a day this year to just service the minimum payment due. So I'm as frustrated as anybody. But I wish we could channel some of our angst into discussing the true drivers of the deficit and the debt in this country. Because if you're going to spend about the same amount of money on discretionary spending in 2019 and 20 as you did in 2010, the discretionary budget isn't the problem. Now, thanks for allowing me to get up on my soapbox. I want to direct the last couple of minutes of my questions regarding Yucca Mountain. I said in my opening that I've been to Yucca Mountain. We've talked favorably about nuclear energy as part of the portfolio that's so important to our country and probably among the cleanest things that we do in terms of powering our nation. But we have 100, the number escapes me, you may know, Rich, a number of sites. I have one in my district that is storing spent nuclear fuel. And in my strong opinion, we need to have this spent nuclear fuel consolidated somewhere. And all the science that anybody can read points to the fact that Yucca Mountain could be a repository for, I may be wrong on this, but I think it was 1 million years. I can't think how long that is, but a millennium. So anyway, we are currently 20 years behind in implementing the program that was authorized by Congress. So Rich, does it make sense to have an operating nuclear waste program? And help me understand why we shouldn't be following through with the commitment that we made on Yucca Mountain.
Well, first, Ranking Member Womack, thank you for your leadership on clean energy appropriations. Thank you for your leadership in co-sponsoring the Leading Act. Thank you for your leadership on nuclear energy and the spent fuel issue. It is essential that we have a resolution to the question of spent fuel or nuclear waste in this country. It is, as some would say, an albatross around the neck of this industry. It contributes to a negative public perception of the industry, and that is very important. It's important if we ever want to think about siting new nuclear reactors and expanding this again. We've got a legal obligation to put that in a permanent repository. It seems like Yucca Mountain is a terrific place for that permanent repository. At ClearPath, we also think it would be a good idea to think about interim solutions as well as the permanent repository is being created. And we also think it's important to remember that that nuclear fuel, that spent fuel, has only had about 3% used. It's just our existing reactors can't use more of it than that. Advanced reactors could use a whole lot more. And so we would argue that when we deposit that fuel, we should do so in a way so that it can be recovered, and the rest of that really important energy could be used one day in advanced reactors as well.
Why is American advanced nuclear development important to the global effort on satisfying the changing climate?
Well, if we think about the global energy picture, there are a lot of places that aren't blessed with, say, the renewable resources that the United States are. We've got a lot of open land. We've got a lot of great wind and sunshine in the United States. We can go really far with renewables, not all the way with renewables, but really far with renewables in the United States. There are a lot of other parts of the world with huge populations that are going to have really high energy demand that don't have those same resources. Look at something like Indonesia, right? A country of 225 million people, nearly as many as the United States, spread across 10,000 very small islands, right? And that country is actually exploring floating advanced nuclear reactors as a way to both meet its climate change commitments and power the future for its people. So there are going to be a lot of parts of the world that need an option like that, a really energy-dense, low-cost, highly flexible option to power growing populations.
I want to thank the panel again. Very enlightening discussion this morning. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for having it. I'm going to yield back the remaining minute of my time.
I thank the ranking member, and I now yield myself 10 minutes. And I want to thank the ranking member for his comments earlier regarding levels of discretionary spending. And one of the remarks made earlier was that we were raising spending in this budget deal by $320 billion. And the question is, against what? And we were raising, that's not against last year's spending or the year before, that's against the sequestration level caps that were put in 2011. So we are basically at the same spending level we've been for a long time. And I also want to commend the ranking member whose commitment to finding a better way to do the budget process is as strong as anyone in this Congress. And he spent a year leading us in a bipartisan, bicameral attempt to find better ways to approach budgeting. And we have agreement on a number of items, and hopefully we can pursue those. But let's turn back to the
Don't forget this guy right here, too, because he was part
That's
of
right.
that.
Mr. Woodall was a very important part of that effort. I want to return to the theme of the hearing and reference a comment that Mr. Scott made earlier in his remarks, that really what we're talking about when we talk about climate change and the budget and our response to it here is the cost of doing nothing. And I think that's where this hearing has contributed a great deal of important information because we've seen in various segments of our economy and our national institutions what the cost of doing nothing is. And that's one of the things that I think we have to remain focused on, because doing nothing is really not an alternative for this country. And we've seen private sector responses from Unilever and others, and that's very important. But I want to focus on some of the things that were in written testimony that maybe didn't come out. And one of the things, Ms. Grant, that I was stunned with in your written testimony was the comment about if we do nothing, what percentage of the annual family's budget could conceivably be spent on food as opposed to what currently is? I think the current average is right around 13%.
12.7% today, and looking at developing countries and what they're paying, it could go up to 60 or 70% of total budget, total household budget could go towards food.
That's a stunning number, and when you consider what we know in this United States, what people pay for housing as a percentage of their budget, to add a huge percentage of that to food makes basic living unsustainable. So we've got to, in addition to whatever cost the taxpayers will face through the federal budget from climate change, we've got a lot of very significant direct costs as well. Admiral Phillips, and I echo my colleagues in thanking all of those military representatives for their service. One of the things that impressed me about your testimony was that we were focused primarily, or the hearing was supposed to be focused primarily on the federal budget, but what became very clear is there is a huge cost to climate change at the state level and the local level through the taxes on those levels. Could you elaborate on how the local, state and local taxes have been affected by your efforts to create resilience?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for that question. I think I'd like to refer to some work that has been done by the city of Virginia Beach. They've spent quite a bit of time doing analysis within their city, within their budget, to understand what the costs of doing nothing for them are now and what they will be over time. And so what they've found through their analysis, and they're working with the Dewberry, who's a consultant, which is helping them with this, is that today, their costs in dealing with rising waters and flood impacts in their city are about $26 million a year. With another 18 inches of sea level rise, those costs, if they do nothing, rise to $77 million a year. With another 3 feet of sea level rise, those costs rise to $329 million a year. So if they do nothing, by the time we get to another 3 feet of sea level rise, which would be later this century, according to predictions and scientific data we have right now for our region, that Hampton Roads region, they'll be paying $329 million, roughly, annually, based on their analysis, without doing any other activity. So when you put that against their work to develop solutions and their bill that they have right now, roughly $2.4 billion in solutions that will help protect some large portion, at least a quarter of their city, that helps bring those costs down considerably. In fact, the solution that they're most interested in pursuing would bring those costs down to almost $33 million a year. But there's still a cost of $33 million a year. So then they'd have to work on what the next set of solutions are to try to eliminate that kind of cost as well. This is one city of 17 in the Hampton Roads Planning District alone. There are 8 planning districts in coastal Virginia, roughly everything east of I-95, urban, suburban, rural, and industrial. They all have different costs and challenges ahead of them, but just as an example, these are very large costs for one state to try to deal with. And so the challenge for the state is, and the challenge for the cities, how do we come up with that? What do we do with our debt in that context? How do we plan and prepare? Virginia Beach is a wealthy city. What about less wealthy cities? What are their choices? What about rural communities? What are their choices? They have far less tax to deal with. So we have this conundrum of the need to be able to borrow to buy down risk. The ratings agencies telling them if you borrow more, then your credit rating is at risk itself, and so we won't let you borrow anymore. And so we have this paradox of trying to buy down our risk, trying to reduce our costs, and then not being able to do that because of our credit rating. So that's a challenge at the state level, but it's also a challenge that goes right down to the local level for cities and communities and localities.
Thank you. Admiral Titli, you mentioned one thing in your testimony that I had not thought about, but the fact that we have growing urbanization around the world and that many of those cities are in coastal communities which would tend to be affected more. Is there anything, I mean, we're having increasing urbanization in this country as well. Is there anything about the urban setting that makes people there or the threat to them from climate change greater than elsewhere?
Thank you, sir, for the question. I think what it is, for any of us, and probably most of us have lived in, some kind of city at some point. Once you're there, I mean, the good thing is you have a lot of infrastructure to support you, but the bad thing is if that infrastructure is disrupted from whatever cause, it's, if you're in an apartment building or if you're in a very small lot, you are dependent on those services that are no longer there. You can't just go out into your field and move 3 acres up because that's not the life you're leading. So I think I talked about, I call it sort of the correlations go to zero, and I think a tremendous challenge is going to be that, given this rich discussion we had on lack of increase in discretionary funding, kind of what I mentioned earlier is the ice, unfortunately, doesn't care that where our discretionary funding is. It just keeps melting, and just the sea level rise component alone, we've talked a lot of other things, is going to drive hundreds of billions and perhaps trillions of dollars, certainly trillions globally. If we start looking at 2, 3, 4 feet, how do we deal with this? And we're going to need to deal with it more or less at the same time. We don't get to say, California, you guys get to wait till 2120. You know, New Orleans, hang on for 60 years. I mean, while we deal with Miami. We don't get that luxury. Everybody, I think, sir, is going to come to the Congress and the representatives saying, my district needs, and they need it now. How do we deal with that? And can we start planning how we're going to deal with that now?
Thank you. Mr. Powell, I appreciated your testimony very much, and I'm going to ask a question and make the mistake of asking a question I don't know the answer to. But back around 2010, we created, when we were in the majority and President Obama was president, we created a significant fund in the DOE. It was about, I think, $37 billion that was low-interest loans to incentivize innovation in the energy field. And most people know that only as the fund that funded Solyndra. But is that the type of initiative that you're referencing, that where the government could be helpful? And with the little time I have left, what was either good or bad about that initiative?
So that's the Department of Energy's Loan Program Office. Contrary to popular belief, it's still very much alive. So there's still about $40 billion of authority left in that program. There's still significant authority for advanced fossil energy projects, advanced nuclear energy projects, some left for very large renewable projects and advanced vehicle projects as well. I think a few things went wrong, around the Solyndra project, obviously, but overall, that program has had terrific performance, right? It has sort of launched the birth of the commercial scale solar and wind industry. It was very helpful in scaling up Tesla, sort of now our national champion electric vehicle manufacturer, and it was extremely important in getting the first generation 3+ nuclear reactor in the great state of Georgia, now constructed, the Vogtle 3 and 4 reactors. So it's actually been quite a successful program, and we do think that a continuing role for some kind of financing for early commercial technologies is a really important part of the federal toolkit. The commercial lending sector is just not willing to take technology risk on big loans. And so having a kind of a federal bridge there that often brings in private sector financing as well around it, we think is a really important role for the federal innovation apparatus.
I appreciate that. Unfortunately, my time's expired. 10 minutes can go by quickly. Dr. Benjamin, I didn't have a chance to ask you a question, but I thank you as well as the remaining members of the panel for a really important discussion, and all of you made significant contributions to what I think will be a pretty important committee record. So with that, I will remind members that they can submit written questions to be answered later in writing. Those questions and your answers will be made part of the formal hearing record. Any member who wishes to submit questions for the record may do so within 7 days. And with that, once again, thanks to all of our panel and the committee members, and without objection, this hearing is adjourned. Yeah.
Can